Hi, I'm Marty Suydam. This presentation is about the Fraser family, often overlooked but nevertheless important founding family of Arlington, Virginia. This presentation is about the Fraser family and their Green Valley plantation, and what became of the family and the plantation. Contents are extracted from a book I published in 2020, Walks with Charley, Sniffing Arlington Ridge History and Mystery, 2nd edition. If you want to know more about a particular location or subject, you can refer to the stories noted as follows. On the street where you live, Arlington Ridge. Founding Families of Arlington Ridge, Fraser, the first 100 years. Founding Families of Arlington Ridge, Fraser, the second 100 years. Green Valley, Antebellum. Green Valley, Civil War. Green Valley, Post-Bellum. During spring 2021, I taught a 5-session walking course based on Walks with Charley. During the sessions, I frequently quoted the writing of the Rambler, J. Harry Shannon, 1869 to 1928, a historian, journalist, and reporter of the Washington area over 100 years ago. This image appears in the beginning of the book, This Was Virginia, 1900 to 1927, published in 1998. The book is a collection of glass negatives photographed by Shannon. The caption on the photograph reads, Mr. Shannon, the journalist photographer who is the illustrious man we pay homage to in the following chapters, was born 3 April 1869 in Baltimore, Maryland. His early boyhood years, however, were spent in Anacostia, District of Columbia. As a boy, natural history and collecting relics were interests that remained with him throughout his lifetime. Another early interest noted and appreciated in the 22 October 1880 Alexandria Gazette was oration. J. Harry Shannon, a boy orator, will give an exhibit of his wonderful powers at Armory Hall tonight. The press of the country speak in the highest terms of the boy and the entertainments given by him. The Philadelphia press says he renders the thoughts of the most eminent writers with dignity and eloquence which cannot be surpassed. Among the selections tonight will be Lee's Farewell to the Army. Figure 2 is an extract of an 1878 map with a black oval circumscribing the Arlington Ridge area as it appeared at the time, very few buildings and roads. The diagonal, unimproved road running north-south with Addison near the center is today's Arlington Ridge Road. The area that would become the Pentagon, green oval, is in the upper left corner of the figure. The light blue oval generally circumscribes Green Valley with the location of the Green Valley Manor noted by Anthony Fraser on right. Figure 6 is a modern map of Arlington Ridge identifying the community associations, Arlington Ridge, Aurora Highlands, Crystal City, and Long Branch Creek in the area. The light blue oval is the general area of Fraser's Green Valley plantation. When I began my search for Fraser family history, I decided to use Ancestry.com to build a family tree that might put names in a time sequence that helped understanding, as well as try to find surviving family members to interview. While any family history of the Frasers will likely center on Anthony Fraser, he was born in 1793 in Fairfax, Virginia, and died in Arlington, Virginia, 1881. After searching for 7 years, I've been unsuccessful in finding a picture of the man. I suspect all pictures paintings were destroyed when the mansion burned. However, I was able to get a picture of his younger brother, by 5 years, James, so it is possible there may be a similarity, but more about Anthony Fraser later. Going backwards in time, his father, William Fraser Sr., was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and died in Arlington in 1824 at Green Valley. He married Maria Magdalena von Reinzel in 1782 when he was 32 and she was 19. He owned a lot on the west side of Pitt Street and south side of King Street in Alexandria in 1798 with an occupation of blacksmith. By 1804, his occupation had changed to tavern keeper. His residences, according to U.S. Census, were Fairfax, 1785, Alexandria, 1786, Fairfax County, 1787, and Alexandria, 1820 and 1823. William's father, Donald Daniel Fraser, was born in 1720 in Inverness, Scotland. He married Mary Beale in 1748 when he was 28 and she was 18 years of age. He leased land from the Alexanders starting in 1758, having immigrated to Tidewater, Virginia prior to that time. He died in 1824 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. An abbreviated version of the Fraser family tree traces the direct lineage from Anthony Fraser to the last surviving family member connected directly to Green Valley, Celine DePack. Precia Lee Fraser married Anthony Fraser in 1823. Precia Antonia Fraser, born 1834, married Jackson Sickles, 1870, died in 1919 in Toronto, Canada. One of their children, Francesca Frances Lee Fraser Sickles Carter Anderson, born 1881, married Herbert Perring Carter. She also married an Anderson. Died 1957, Suffolk, England. They had a child, Mary Fraser Carter DePack, who married David DePack, parents of Celine DePack, born 1957. In an exchange of emails with Celine DePack, she revealed the following about her mother Mary and grandmother Frances. My grandmother was institutionalized more than once as a paranoid schizophrenic, and my mother shared some of those characteristics, so a haze of questionable memories tinges my knowledge. My grandmother died at my grandmother's estate in England that she'd gotten in their divorce. She left the U.S. to avoid another competency hearing and further loss of her independence. She died when I was a year old and I never met her. The facts are likely to be at least as painful as they are colorful. The only direct documentation I have of my grandmother's life are some notes I found after my father's death that he took during her final U.S. hearing, when he and my mother sought to have her declared non compos mentis. My grandmother was dependent on morphine during much of her life and was taken advantage of at many points. The family holdings were depleted to a succession of ventures, and whether or not it would have been a kindness to have her taken away her liberty to preserve her assets is an open question. After she left for England, the property and its remaining buildings under caretaker Willie Thompson deteriorated. Mrs. Sickles never returned. The barn burned in the 1960s along with the remaining servants' house being vandalized. 30 years later, not much remained other than a few foundations. A neighbor, Bill White, who in the early 1960s moved to South Pierce Street, a block away from the Fraser House site, borrowed Pachysandra that thrives today from the Fraser House site. He remembers the site being near the intersection of the current South Queen and South Rolfe Streets. By the 1940s, the vast property that originally spanned much of today's Arlington Ridge and Army-Navy Country Club had been reduced to the Frances Lee Anderson property shown in the map extracted from the Sanborn Fire Insurance map, figure 77. It was bounded by Army-Navy Drive, South Glebe Road, Arlington Ridge Road, and the high ground area approximately bordered by South 24th Street, South Pierce, and South 23rd Streets. During World War II, it would shrink further with Shirley and Arna Valley home developments. The 1950s would see it shrink further with the development of Gunston Middle School campus and adjoining shopping area. This is the 1935 Sanborn Fire Insurance map that identifies key land ownership for that year and has arrows pointing to a few of the key locations discussed in today's session. The large green area, lower center, is the remaining land, 121 acres, that had not been sold from Fraser's Green Valley by 1935. This is the property of Frances Lee Anderson, an heir. More on her later. I'll pause for 5 seconds so you can view. In the mid-1800s, the manor was a grand house with a panoramic view including the Potomac River. Local legend has it that Green Valley Manor was named for the valley in between a house on the facing ridge owned by James Green near the current clubhouse at Army-Navy Country Club. In 1821, Anthony Fraser, F-R-A-S-E-R, sometimes spelled F-R-A-Z-I-E-R, built a home and named it Green Valley Manor. It was located on the floor of a valley about 100 yards from Long Branch, near the intersection of the current South Queen Street in Forest Hills Townhouse development and the South 23rd Street, formerly Fraser Road. Considered a mansion, the house was built in 1821 on a 1,000-acre plantation. Even though located in Virginia, the story is that a member of the Fraser family did not believe in slavery and freed slaves, providing them land and money to build their own homes. As opposed to neighbors who were imprisoned and lost most everything during the war, the Frasers fared much better. At the outset of the Civil War, Union forces occupied the Fraser plantation and established Fort Richardson on the high point of the opposing ridge. Again, not an eye test, but from an article focusing on Army-Navy Country Club and mostly about Green Valley by Lester Inskeep, staff correspondent for the Star, July 27, 1929. The title was Old Slabs on Army, Navy, and Marine Corps Course. When William Fraser made his will in 1825, more than a century ago, directing that a quarter of an acre of his farm on the hills of Virginia overlooking Washington be converted into a permanent burial ground for him and his family, little did he dream that he would rest in the middle of a golf course, and that knicker-clad players would daily pass his final resting place and muse upon the presence of his tombstone there. Such, however, is the case. But the final wish of this old pioneer has been carried out to the letter, and it is highly probable that he will always rest in the spot of his choice. For officials of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps Country Club who have acquired his once swampy farm and converted it into one of the most picturesque spots in the vicinity of the national capital have decreed that William Fraser, his family, and his slaves shall slumber peacefully beneath their woodland bower. Nor is the burying ground the only evidence left by the Fraser family on the property now owned by the club. The mansion was burned many years ago, but the old stone spring house, oblivious to time, has become the center of gay picnic parties, now being surrounded by stone tables and a stone stove, and only evidence of modern progress at this spot along Long Branch, the stream that runs through the club property and that lies below the Arlington Ridge. The burial ground, which has aroused much interest among club members and their guests, is situated between the 4th green and the 5th tee. Every golfer who plays the first 9 holes of the course must pass it, but it has been preserved so nearly in its original state, surrounded as it is by a group of old cedars, dogwood, and myrtle, that few notice it for the first time they pass. The family graves are surrounded by an iron fence, and the slaves rest in unmarked mounds outside. According to George E. Garrett, former directing engineer of Arlington County and a historian of note, the land on which the club is located is a part of a 6,000-acre tract that was granted by Governor William Berkeley to Robert Howson in 1669. The records show that the grant was compensation for transporting 120 persons, but fails to go more into detail. In the years that followed, the land gradually became divided, and the next record of interest is the will of William Fraser, designating the burial ground. The club obtained that part of the property on which are located the 2 points of interest from Mrs. Herbert Carter. There are other historical points on the golf course, however, for immediately to the north of the clubhouse is the site of Fort Richardson, one of the chain of fortifications that surrounded Washington during the Civil War. This fort is situated 225 feet above tidewater. The old fortifications, rifle pits, and outpost positions that practically surround the burial ground are in their original state and are to be marked, according to Major Richard D. Newman, manager of the club. Today, tombstones enclosed by an iron fence are clearly noticeable adjoining the path between Army-Navy Country Club golf course holes Blue 8 and 9. The burial mounds of slaves interred outside the fence enclosure have vanished. The old Fraser home was constructed in 1850 of bricks that were imported from England and landed in the port of Alexandria in 1849. Since it no longer stands, the old boxwoods have been removed to the clubhouse, where they now lend an air of impressive dignity. In commenting upon the work of preparing the ground for the course, Major Newman said that they found much old pine log draining into an excellent state of preservation. The ground had not been cleared for more than 40 years, he said. There was also a ram in the old spring house that had been used to force water to the mansion, which was situated on the opposite slope from that now occupied by the clubhouse. Situated in the center of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps Country Club golf course, players find a real mental and perhaps superstitious hazard in a small cemetery, which, history reveals, was established there in 1825 by the will of William Fraser as a burying ground for him and his family. Club officials are maintaining it, as well as the old Fraser Estate Spring House, in the original state. The cemetery was left intact when fortifications were established around it during the Civil War. Figure 101 portrays the Green Valley area at the beginning of the Civil War. The area shown in the map extract is about 75% of Fraser's property in Green Valley. While labeled Convalescent Camp, it had not been constructed at the time the map was made. The following homeowners are identified: Biederman, east of Fort Richardson; Fraser, lower right, east of Convalescent Camp; and Addison, upper right border. The regular pattern trees are orchards, other trees likely to be oaks, all which were cut down during the war for fortification, fields of fire, and firewood, and tuft symbols, grassland, and pasture. The catalog of data from successive census is useful in documenting not only the changes in how census was reported, but the level of detail recorded as the census matured. Using Ancestry.com to search and later retain census documents was an important aid in this research. The first U.S. Census, 1790, listed William Fraser household with 3 white souls, 1 dwelling, and 3 outbuildings. The 1830 and 1840 census added demographic information of family members. The 1860 census reports Fraser, and spelled Frazier, as a farmer living at building number 1981, Jefferson District, Alexandria County, Virginia. His property and possessions were worth $40,000 and $20,000 respectively, about $1.2 million and $0.6 million today, assuming inflation only. But the real worth of Green Valley is many times that. In the same census, the Lee, R.E., property was worth $60,000. By 1880, the census reported only 5 people living at the residence. The 1880 census also included non-population information about property, including acres of land, farm values, fences, labor, grasslands by type, horses, mules, meat and cattle, sheep, swine, and crops by type. With the onset of the Civil War, Antebellum Green Valley would lose much of its green. The hills were stripped of trees. It became a site of a large convalescent center treating war wounded. Today, the area has returned to be a vulnerable Green Valley existing in an encroaching urban sprawl. One of my favorite articles uncovered when I was researching Walks with Charley was by The Rambler and published in the Washington Star newspaper, March 1915. This slide is not intended to be an eye test, but only to show you what the Rambler's articles looked like. I was able to access a clean copy using the newspapers.com service, a great research resource. The newspapers.com database includes more than 73 million pages from over 3,000 newspapers starting back in the 1700s, allowing the historical researcher relatively easy and quick access to information that heretofore took very long plowing through hard copy or microfiche. I'll read relevant portions of the article. It was very exciting to me to be able to easily access the words written over 100 years ago that were long ago history for us, but fresh happenings back then. When the Rambler wrote the story about Green Valley, Army-Navy Drive was still named Old Georgetown Pike. The Rambler relates, Green Valley, beginning in the Arlington Highlands and gently sloping and widening to its junction with the valley of 4 Mile Run, is a region which, though close to Washington, is neglected by or unknown by the great majority of Washingtonians. The approaches to the valley head from the direction of Washington are, in some degree, unlovely. But once in the valley or on the crest of the ridges that girt it, its beauty strongly strikes one's fancy, and many stories worth the telling are parts of the history of the valley. There are, of course, more ways than one of reaching Green Valley, but the Rambler followed the old north-south post road, which leads along the east front of Arlington Cemetery, because of the improvement of this ancient way between the Aqueduct Bridge and the Columbia Turnpike and the new road, Columbia Pike, there is an irregularly built village peopled by colored folk, many of them descended from those who settled here under the protection of the Union camps. Hospitals and fortified lines were a feature of that country during the Civil War. These people grouped or herded themselves there after emancipation, and many of them came before emancipation, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them having taken secret leave of their masters in the old plantations in Maryland and Virginia. A good many of the first settlers survive, and the Rambler, in course of the years of his writing, has transcribed from the lips of these old people many interesting narratives. Walking southerly along the road from the aqueduct and passing the southeast end of Arlington Wall, Arlington Cemetery, a steep grade leads up to the crossing of the electric railway, which runs from Washington by way of the Highway Bridge and Arlington Junction to Falls Church, Vienna, Fairfax Courthouse, and 100 intermediate places. Crossing the Columbia Pike and climbing the grade beyond, you come to a height where, weedy and tangled growth, rest the ruins of Fort Albany, and in these ruins stand a brick church about which the Rambler has previously written. It is Mount Zion Colored Baptist Church. It is a bold brick structure with red sides, a dun front, and was erected in 1884. The congregation was organized by ex-slaves, either just before or after emancipation, and that congregation worshipped in a small frame building in the nearby settlement of Freedman's City, or as it was often called, Freedman's Village. That was the village which was wiped out by the southeasterly extension of the Arlington grounds, Arlington Cemetery. Continuing south from the church, you are sensible that your road is passing along the crest of a narrow ridge, the sides of which slope steeply to the east and west. To the west is a narrow valley. It is the head of Green Valley. A branch flows through it, and its name is Long Branch. From the various draws and ravines that run down into Green Valley, many little streams add the flow to that of Long Branch, and that branch, before it has followed its course for a mile, becomes a stream of some magnitude, raging in time of heavy rain and maintaining a very respectable flow even in time of drought. To the east, the ridge away to the flatlands which stretch to the river. The eye can pick out all the familiar buildings in Washington, as well as on the hills that rim the city on the north, west, and east. This is one of the glorious views of this region. On the hilltop off the main road and about a third of a mile from the house is a thicket of tall cedars, their trunks interlaced with honeysuckle vines that have kept green all winter. In this melancholy place, within an iron picket fence, are tombstones. On one of the monuments, the Rambler read the names and dates. William Fraser, died October 1824, aged 75 years. Mary Fraser, wife of William Fraser. Anthony R. Fraser, born November 12, 1794, died February 1, 1881. Prussia Lee Fraser, wife of Anthony Fraser, born 1791, died 1859. William Lee Fraser, born February 17, 1824, died July 7, 1868. This information is enough to show the reader that he is now upon the Fraser estate of Green Valley, which gave its name to this region, and that the old house down the private road with box hedge, the terrace, the lily pond, and the rustic summer house for which changes were made during the term of President Roosevelt. The bed of the valley is not flat, but a succession of low hills and short ridges with vales between. On the opposite slope, on the crest of the farther ridge, are a few houses, nearly all of them new. The rolling, almost rough landscape is yellow with sedge, but clumps and lines of cedars and patches of pines give a clear, cheering touch to the view. A mile or so further down the valley, so far down that the ridge beyond 4 Mile has changed from light, misty blue to rich purple, you come to a place where the main road veers to the south, to the southwest, and a private road leads straight ahead. Down the private road can be seen through the bare branches of many oaks an old house of most substantial build, and so well cared for that but for its chimneys, its dormer windows, and other architectural features, you might mistake it for a new house. Venerable trees grow above the well-kept lawn. A neatly clipped box hedge and a lily pond at the foot of a flight of steps leading up a terrace are items in the picture. The Rambler spent an interesting hour there. Anthony Fraser was the owner of this land when camps and forts covered it from 1861 to 1865. He was an old man then. He had become blind, and the members of his family have told the Rambler that his greatest sorrow was to listen to the sound of hundreds of axes as Union soldiers felled the forest on his land, that the fort guns might have a clear field of fire, that no cover might be afforded to the enemy, and that timber might be obtained for revetments for the earthworks, for barracks, for the convalescent camp close by, and for many other purposes. In that old house today lives a daughter of Anthony Fraser and his wife, who is Miss Prescia Lee of Montgomery County, Maryland. The name of the woman is Mrs. Sickles. Mrs. J.F. Sickles, if the Rambler remembers the initials. Her daughter and her daughter's husband also live there. They are Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Carter. The house is full of old mahogany and antique rugs. Oil portraits of the Frasers line the walls of one of the rooms, and a feature of the dining room is one of the white marble mantels. An interesting feature of the Green Valley farm is a barn whose sides are heavy white pine planking, at least a century old and still in a well-preserved condition. Anthony Fraser was both a successful farmer and businessman and was very active in his community. A story that ran in the Washington Evening Star, September 11, 1897, 16 years after he died, entitled Our Departed Half, the Restoration of Alexandria County to the District, belief 50 years ago that this separation was unconstitutional, its repeal possible, paints a good characterization of Anthony Fraser associated with a current event at that time related to Virginia retrocession. Extracts from the article follow. We need only to recall the past to comprehend how wide apart, often absolutely antagonistic, may be the interests of Alexandria City and Alexandria County. We are reverting to a back number, a remote incident dating back half a century, yet fraught with far-reaching and disastrous consequence to the progress and prosperity of Alexandria County. In 1846, by vote of the people of the city of Alexandria, then occupying an area of less than 1.5 square miles, the people of Alexandria County and the territory they owned and occupied, containing 38.5 square miles, were, in utter defiance of their almost unanimous wish as expressed at the polls, transferred and remanded from the District of Columbia to the state of Virginia. The city of Alexandria had very good reasons for desiring the so-called retrocession. Its taxpayers were being handsomely paid for it by being relieved of a heavy burden of corporate indebtedness which the state of Virginia agreed to assume. But to the citizens and taxpayers of Alexandria County, there were in this change from federal to state jurisdiction no present or prospective considerations of profit or advantage, and on this pregnant question, so deeply affecting the property interests of the county, those who were immediately concerned, their will, their wishes, were as completely ignored as if they had no existence whatsoever south of the Potomac. In passing, we must pause to say that this flagrant outrage was perpetuated during the administration of Polk, when politicians of the school of Calhoun were in full control of the government, men who affected to believe in and insist upon a strict construction of the federal Constitution, and who pretended to demand that no doubtful powers should be exercised by Congress or any branch of the central government. How thoroughly insincere these politicians were is shown by their advocacy of a measure which involved the astounding assertion of a right on the part of Congress to amend one of the weightiest and most essential provisions of the Constitution itself. Among those citizens of Alexandria County who led the general sentiment of opposition to this unrighteous, lawless measure was the late Anthony R. Fraser, an old resident, a large property holder, and one of the most prominent, far-sighted, and energetic of its citizens. In some degree, doubtful at his insistence, a handsome sum was raised in the county to test the constitutionality of the act of Congress, and Mr. Fraser was selected by those who contributed to the fund to wait upon Mr. Webster to retain him as counsel to represent Alexandria County in the legal proceedings then proposed to be instituted before the Supreme Court of the United States. The article continues to the end, since the language is so interesting and colorful. In the interview had with Mr. Webster, he told Mr. Fraser that for the moment, constituted as the court then was, any steps in the direction suggested would be, to use Mr. Webster's words, only a waste of time and money. But, added Mr. Webster in his most emphatic manner, a time will come when this action of Congress will be reviewed by that high tribunal which alone can take cognizance of it, and when that adjudication it will be possible for the court to render but one decision in the case, namely, that Congress had clearly transcended its powers in the act by which the District of Columbia was rent asunder. At this moment of writing, the citizens of Alexandria County are a unit in the desire that the old boundaries of the district should be restored, though they would not insist that the city of Alexandria shall be torn from her moorings against her will. Everyone knows that were Alexandria County a part of the district, it would soon become by far the most attractive and most densely populated suburb of the capital city. Had it been a part of the district 10 short years ago, we should now be rejoicing in the magnificent boulevards which would lead to the Memorial Bridge, and instead of the 2 or 3 electric lines which now traverse our county, there would be a network, an entanglement of railways giving rapid transit to and from the most distant portions of the county. Lacking these facilities, large parts of our county are remote, isolated, inaccessible, and sites of incomparable beauty, overlooking the dome which crowns the capital, as the Palatine Hill overlooks St. Peter's, as Florence is seen from the heights of Frisote, may be had for little more than a song, and these too are within, or can be brought within, and will be, by railway development, 10 minutes of Pennsylvania Avenue. Has Alexandria County then to be tied to a car of good old sleepy Alexandria? We think not. We suspect that the citizens of Alexandria County may have plans, purposes, enterprises, hopes of their own, in which the ancient city cannot have any part or lot, to which it cannot contribute or further, and which it cannot hinder or interfere with. The Manor House burned in 1924. This is the November 6th Associated Press article of the house fire that states, Green Valley Manor House, historic Virginia landmark 30 miles from here, was reduced to smoldering ruins today by fire of undetermined origin, and 2 of 4 naval officers occupying it were injured. The estimated loss of $30,000 was said to be not an exact figure which cannot be arrived at this time, as the estate contained antiques and historic relics. Firemen from Washington and nearby Virginia towns aided in quenching the flames. The 2 officers injured were Lieutenants Thomas E. Lattimore and John L. Lusk. They are being treated at the Naval Hospital here, where it was said their burns are not serious. When the main house of Green Valley Manor burned in 1924, Mrs. Sickles and her daughter Mary were in England. Francesca, Frances, Lee, Fraser, Sickles, Carter, Anderson, was living in the servants' house that remained after the house burned. Born at Green Valley Manor, she retained her maiden name through 2 marriages, Anderson and Carter, although official deeds and records of Arlington show Frances Lee Anderson. She died in Bournemouth, Dorset, England in 1956. Her portrait is in the possession of Arlington Historical Society. Her daughter, Mary Fraser Carter DePack, died in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1998. The Green Valley Manor House site remained undeveloped until the 1970s, when the Forest Hills townhouses were built on the site. As late as the 1980s, it was reported that parts of the fireplace foundation and walls remain concealed by vegetation. If those remains did exist, they are no longer there today. The barn was burned by vandals in the 1960s, and only a few parts of the foundation exist today. There are, however, remains of the barn foundations up the hill from South Queen Street. Figures 76 and 78. This is Fraser Park, a small 2-acre Arlington County park that has the very large conduit for Long Branch Creek, the mound in the foreground of this picture, running underneath and surfacing just beyond the split rail fence line. From this spot, we are very near the Fraser Spring House location. It was recorded that George Washington stopped frequently at the spring for drinking water, and no doubt he paused there also with his troops when moving through the area on his way to Yorktown in September 1781. Despite the historic and key role of the Fraser properties, the growth of this area, the name of Fraser is all but completely unknown and unrecognized by current citizens of Arlington County. There are no schools, streets, or other public facilities that bear the name of that pioneer family, nor are there many today who would even know that the Fraser family once lived in this area, except for Fraser Park. Another great resource for those interested in Arlington history are the journals, newsletters, and historical magazine published by the Arlington Historical Society. A good story written over 20 years ago, October 2000, and published in the Arlington Historical Journal is the story by Sherman Pratt about Green Valley. Now, another 20 years of history has happened, but it is fun and interesting to listen to another reporter of history, not today, but yesterday. Anthony Fraser's great-grandfather, Daniel Fraser of Scotland, a nephew of Simon Fraser, the last man beheaded in the Tower of London in 1747, arrived in Virginia as a ship's stowaway. Daniel's son William is recorded as settling in northern Virginia in the mid-1700s as a tenant of the Alexander family that had built Abingdon, and the ruins of which are between the parking garages of Reagan National Airport. William's son, William Jr., the father of Anthony, acquired from the Alexander family several hundred acres of land straddling Lower Long Branch, a tributary of 4 Mile Run. The lands were known as Green Valley, perhaps named for James Green, who lived in the area near the present location of the clubhouse at Army-Navy Country Club. On those lands in the valley floor, about 100 yards from Long Branch, Anthony Fraser built his home, Green Valley Manor, in 1821, 3 years before his father, William, died. In selecting the site for his home, Anthony must have been influenced by the existence of a productive spring where he also built his spring house. This is the intersection of South 28th Street and Army-Navy Drive, looking south. Fraser Park is straight ahead. Long Branch Creek is in the middle of the picture with a mound that has the Long Branch Creek in a tunnel that runs under Shirley Highway, I-395, and exiting in the wooded area beyond the park, becoming a surface stream once again. This slide captures 2 Sanborn Fire Insurance map snapshots for 1936 and 1959. Focusing on the alignment of Army-Navy Drive and Long Branch Creek before and after Shirley Highway was constructed. Scale is the same. You can see how Long Branch Creek was rerouted under the highway and the Army-Navy Drive was separated. I'll pause for 5 seconds so you can view the change comparison. Note the bottom left of the 1959 image, the location of Dolly Madison Junior High School, later Gunston Junior High School, and even later demolished and replaced by Dolly Madison Condominium. This picture is of the Fraser home circa 1915, showing 2 houses, an uphill view of the Green Valley Manor and the servant's house. Anthony Fraser's daughter married J.E. Sickles and inherited the property. Francesca, Frances Lee Fraser Sickles Carter Anderson, born at Green Valley Manor, she retained her maiden name through 2 subsequent marriages, Anderson and Carter, although official deeds and records of Arlington would show only Frances Lee Anderson. She died in Bournemouth, Dorset, England in 1956. The main house of Green Valley Manor burned in 1924 and was never rebuilt. Mrs. Sickles and her daughter Mary were in England. After the fire, she lived in the servant's house for several years. In an email exchange with Selina DePack, the sole remaining family member with direct ancestral relationship to Green Valley Manor, she provides some insight into the state of the property after the fire. My mother and her mother lived in the servants' quarters of Green Valley after the manor burned. My mother told a story of young vandals who came up through the golf course that she ran off with a pistol. 2 eccentric women living with an elderly black butler were more or less an easy target for opportunists and bullies. A longtime resident of Arlington Ridge, Ann Donahue, remembers as a child in the 1930s how mean old Mrs. Sickles would chase them away with her shotgun and dogs. This picture was taken from the opposite location looking uphill, now Forest Hills townhouses, intersection of South Rolfe and South 28th Street. 50 years ago, when the Forest Hills development was started, the hillside was stripped of trees. Some in the area then referred to it as forestless hills. Today it is difficult to get a view of those same townhouses because the area has much matured and a clear picture is no longer possible. but they are now nestled in a mature urban forest, forested hills. This modern aerial photograph shows the area around Green Valley Manor with locations identified by arrows. Manor House number 1, Servants' House number 2, Barn number 3, Graveyard number 4, and today's Fraser Park number 5. Picture taken from Arlington Ridge looking west, likely taken near the Addison House, shows the fort on the right horizon built in the fall of 1861. The dirt road leading up the hill toward the fort traces a route near the current Memorial Drive, a westerly extension of Addison Avenue, now 20th Street South. The area also included tent camps and hospitals and a scattering of frame dwellings. I'll pause for 5 seconds so you can study the picture. A picture of Fort Richardson with its tent camp shows the view to the southeast with a hill area in the left distance, Arlington Ridge. The Rambler took this picture of a colored family living near the remains of Fort Richardson in 1915. A view of Army-Navy Country Club golf course, hole red 9 from Google Earth shows remnants of the earthworks of Fort Richardson. The Rambler wrote in the Evening Star, January 3, 1913, quoted a Civil War veteran, "I helped to build this fort working a week at spading on high land half a mile south of the Columbia Pike and a quarter of a mile west of the little stream Long Branch which ripples down Green Valley. My regiment was the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, the first siege train organized after European models on this continent. My company, G, was recruited at Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut, and information of the knowledge of mathematics which a number of the men in this company had coming to the attention of the regimental and other high officers, among others, was taken out of the ditches and set at work of computing ranges by triangulation to all prominent or possibly important points within range of the guns of this fort. The soldier, a little stooped and gray, pulled from his pocket a large notebook of yellow paper that once was white. It was written all over with ink lines that had faded until they were very pale. This book contained the original data. Here was jotted down the distance to about every piece of land that could be reached from Fort Richardson and the problem as it was worked out. I used a hand sextant and these formula, which familiar to a man at college, but which soon get out of mind if they are not kept there by practice. And few men ever keep them in practice if they do not use them in their business. The sides of a plane triangle are proportional to the sides of their opposite angles, and in any triangle, the sum of two sides containing either angle is to their difference as the tangent of half the sum of the two other angles to the tangent of half their difference. And in any plane triangle, if a line is drawn from the vertical angle perpendicular to the base, dividing it into two segments, then the whole base, or sum of the segments, is the sum of the two other sides, as the difference of those sides to the difference of segments. And in any right angle plane triangle, the radius is the tangent of either of the acute angles as the side adjacent to the side opposite. Pointing out over the rolling fields to the south of Fort Richardson, land leading gently down to the junction of Long Branch with 4 Mile Run, not quite a mile away, the soldier said, "The great convalescent camp was spread over these fields, and at one time there were 15,000 men in that camp, just getting strong again after being in a hospital with wounds or sickness. Over there," pointing to the westward in the direction of Fort Berry and Fort Barnard, was the distribution camp. Thousands of men were there. Having graduated from hospitals and the convalescent camp, they were now in the distribution camp awaiting reassignment to their former commands or assignment to other organizations. The big brick house down there in Green Valley was the home of Anthony Fraser, and his children and grandchildren are living there now. I remember Anthony Fraser because many times I went down to that fine old house for milk or water. Fort Richardson and the convalescent camp, I think, were on Fraser's land, and Fort Berry, Fort Bernard, and the distribution camp were on Corbett's land, the Corbett House having been torn down because it occupied part of the site needed for Fort Berry. A great deal of artillery target practice was carried on from these forts, especially from Fort Richardson, where there was organized and conducted for about 3 years an artillery school. Much of the shooting was at targets in the hills south of 4 Mile Run. After I had triangulated about everything that could be reached by gunfire from Richardson, Berry, and Barnard, I was engaged in a similar work for the gunners in Fort Reynolds, Battery, Garesh, Fort Ward, and Fort Worth. I was spotting shots south of Hunting Creek for gunners in the forts north of the valley of Cameron Run, where Fort Lyon blew up. I saw the great cloud of smoke, and a few seconds after heard the roar of the explosion. When the magazine of Lyon blew up, 20 men of the garrison were killed. In the detailed plan diagram of the camp, the hospitals and wards, barracks, officers' quarters, and administrative buildings, patrol and distributing camps, and streets and trails and railroad siding were drawn and identified. In the modern topographic map, Fort Richardson is not shown, but would be above the rectangular hospitals and quarters area, blue arrow. The blue rectangle identifies the location of the main part of the hospital. The camp was established as a hospital and recovery area for wounded convalescents returning to their commands. In January 1864, the camp was reorganized under the camp name Rendezvous of Distribution Camp, adding a stragglers camp, a camp for drafted men and recruits, and a paroled prisoners camp. In addition to providing manpower serving the various Union Army units stationed in the defenses of Washington, the Army engineers used the men in construction of the fortifications in the defenses of Washington. The convalescent camp made an impressive set of good reports. An extract of the camp newspaper, the Soldiers' Journal, reported, among other statistics, that the number of convalescents sent to join their regiments was 98,293. Number of convalescents died, 256. An article in the Soldiers' Journal, a newspaper published at the camp, stated, "The government sent to this camp all stragglers, all detail privates, all the men fit for duty at Camp Convalescent, and thence were sent in large squads to their respective regiments. There were from 5,000 to 8,000 men then in the camp. The post was under the command of Captain Upham. Contiguous to this camp was a camp of recruits, also under the commandant of that post. Still nearer Alexandria, and distinct from the distribution camp, was the camp of paroled prisoners, containing not more than 500 or 600 men, and we learned that somewhere between Camp Metcalf and Fairfax Seminary was a convalescent horse camp, where horses that had been under medical treatment and were on the road to sound health were treated to further rest and fat pasture." If you want to have some fun reading the Soldiers' Journal stories, you can access them through the Library of Congress or Library of Virginia. Just Google. The camp was established as a hospital and recovery area for wounded convalescents returning to their commands. The convalescent camp occupied most of the Army-Navy Country Club golf course area. The entrance to the convalescent camp was in the general area of the Army-Navy Country Club golf course hole White 6. In the original picture, the camera was positioned near the road that later became Army-Navy Drive, and then became a dead-end street when Shirley Highway was developed during World War II. The modern picture, oriented in the same direction as the same location, was taken 158 years later in front of the Dolly Madison Towers condominium. The 50 hospital wards were nothing like modern military wards. Usually there would be 2 rows of beds with a wide aisle. Following battles with large numbers of wounded, beds would be added, allowing only limited aisle movement. Author Benjamin Cooling, commenting on the new convalescent camp, noted, "The second Camp Convalescent was located south of Fort Richardson in the valley. The camp replaced the infamous Camp Misery, which was located on the slopes of Shutter's Hill, northeast of Fort Ellsworth, near Alexandria. The camp was moved to this site and constructed in 1862. After the Civil War, Green Valley returned to life as a quiet farm. The hillsides have been stripped of trees and buildings, hospitals, convalescent camp, and forts were demolished, and Long Branch ran clear water. The Fraser family resumed their farm life, and Green Valley became secluded and forested. While the Frasers had been major landholders in Alexandria County, over time the property maps showed a patchwork of many owners. Eleanor Lee Templeton, in her book Arlington Heritage, stated, "At the mansion site I found traces of the terraced woodland garden where daffodils still bloom, and the masonry steps leading down to the cup of a fish pond or fountain." Another Arlington historian, C. Cornelia B. Rose, Jr., wrote in a newspaper column, "Between the end of the War between the States and the 20th century progress, Green Valley enjoyed about a half a century of rural peace, and was described in 1887 as secluded and not without picturesque pastoral beauty. Green Valley was again a farm or plantation, no longer a busy hospital and convalescent center. Green Valley property was gradually subdivided and transferred many times. By 1900, the estate had been subdivided and was now reduced to 150 acres, with some parcels held by family members. By the 1920s, the various tracts morphed from separate farms to a large golf course and other residential and commercial developments. In 1924, Green Valley Manor was destroyed by fire and Army-Navy Country Club was founded on the property west of Army-Navy Drive that traces the approximate route of the old Georgetown Road. In 2020, we can view Green Valley from space using Google Earth. Trees and beautiful landscaping present a view worth preserving, a beautiful green valley that Anthony Fraser left as a legacy.